fucking gym week here?
Shit, what am I supposed to say? I did an IQ test recently and I failed. And
Does the lower IQ stop you from being able to talk?
I feel under pressure now. What am I supposed to say? Fuck. There was these guys. It was one time.
You used to go to band camp as a kid, didn't you? You used to. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Well, I can actually play more instruments than you, but that's okay.
It's quality over quantity, though, isn't it?
Nah, not when it comes to just sheer intelligence and musical talent. They're like, man, he can play multiple different instruments. You know, you play like one instrument.
Actually, no, I played two.
What's the other one?
Bouzouki.
They're all stringed instruments. It's the same thing.
What?
That's clutchy at straws. Like,
what are you talking about? Are you saying a bouzouki is the same thing? I'm so confused.
You're reaching there now. That's like saying I can play a tin whistle and a wooden tin whistle. That's what you just said there.
That's a wooden tin whistle is a recorder, and they're two different instruments.
There's actually wooden tin whistles as well. It's different.
How can it be a wooden tin whistle?
A flute. It's like saying you play a flute and recorder. That's what you just said there.
But it's not a wooden tin whistle.
You just said
a tin whistle's made of tin.
You just said, "Oh, I can play the flute."
People need to get questions in here quickly.
You just said, "I can
Blaine McConnell just commented. What's up, fellas?"
You just said, "I can play the flute and the tin whistle." Is what you just said.
Blaine, I hope your training for nationals is going very well.
I don't know if I'm on top. No, I'm on top. Chat filter. All messages. Hey, Blaine.
By the way, we're not being super antisocial. We just have the comments for the video in our phone. Right. Everyone's saying hello. I hope everyone's getting on swimmingly on this Wednesday afternoon. Thomas Wright said he got his legacy threes.
They're nice.
Kaiser says, oi, oi, save a lie. I'm sure I'm missing something there. Verdon says, guys, just changed. I'm so proud today. India landed the
Shadrian
on the moon.
Yeah, I saw something that they have been doing a...
Is that a manned space flight?
I actually don't know.
Ireland's never landed anyone on the moon.
No, that's not true. But not Buzz. What was the other guy? No, Buzz was...
Buzz Aldrin.
He's of Irish descent.
Yeah, but that's like Irish.
Yeah, I don't know if it was manned or not. I'd heard a little bit about it. Isn't that crazy that things are so benign that landing something on the moon is just
crazy?
Doesn't even make that news anymore.
Crazy, yeah.
Especially from the most populous nation, I think now, India.
Is it the most populous?
I think so, yeah.
Not that strong says looking solid and tight, gents.
Thick, solid and tight.
Thick, solid and tight.
That's a very old school YouTube joke.
Is it?
It was I think it was a comment left on Jim Wendler's YouTube, and I just went crazy.
Sounds like my arteries. Scott Kerr says, coming to the end of my third run of Sika deadlift, holding out for 265. I've gone from 215 to 265 in a year.
Jesus.
Yes. That's exactly what we want to hear. Great to hear, Scott. Scott's a long-term commenter on the channel.
Sure is.
Liam Cunningham says, brightens up the end of work day to see Sika Strength live stream.
That's great.
Thanks very much. We actually love doing these live streams. Platoon says, well, lads, just wondering if there's any one-to-one coaching available. I sent an email. Sarah will get back to you in the next few days. There's probably not an opening for a while, but Sarah will get back to you.
But if you are looking for coaching, do send it an email.
Send it an email and
put you on a waiting list, because sometimes spots just pop up in the email list, and sometimes people don't get back, and someone else gets back sooner than them or something, and people get in quickly. So do email in and get your spot in the waiting list.
Don't be a stranger, as they'd say. Speaking of one-to-one coaching, Evan Lee says, how's it? Blaine says he's hit 165 off the block, so I'd say it's heading in the right direction. Nice. Great. Thomas Honeyman says, been weightlifting for some time, 100, 130, sub 96 kilos and 5'10", taken a 6 weeks off after lifting those maxes, still training, but no weightlifting. Got a first competition in 3 weeks. What should I do? Start snatching and clean and jerking straight away.
Thomas, get on
and
the
then
snatch.
And then find a competition that's a small bit further than 3 weeks away.
What made possess you to that, Thomas?
6 weeks off is a lot. But first competitions as well, you should just get in, get some lifts on the board, and then do, like, don't worry massively, even if you don't hit 100, 130, or even if you don't PR, just go in and get the lifts done. First competitions is just practicing a skill. Going to the competition and doing well is a skill as much as it is anything else. You just need to practice it.
James C said, how would you train a beginner in weightlifting but has been training for hypertrophy for a while? To be honest, no way different than you would train someone else normally. You know, if there's issues, you would address them. If there's mobility issues, you address them. If there's technique issues, you address them. If there's strength issues, you address them. There's no particular template where you're like, oh, someone who does bodybuilding exclusively coming to weightlifting has all these issues. If I had to guess, I would say maybe you would have mobility issues, but a couple of months ago, I did a one-to-one with someone in London, and never done any snatch or clean and jerk before, ever had a very strong base, called a 250, was absolutely enormous. He was one of the biggest people I've ever met in my life in terms of just like sheer size. Like, we're talking Ronnie Coleman kind of craziness, like massiveness. Not like Ronnie Coleman at his peak, but probably Ronnie Coleman before he took a whole hope of gear. But this dude is huge. Just turned out to be super flexible, like ridiculously flexible. Snatched 100 kilo after like 2 months. I did the first session with him. He'd literally never snatched before. We did the bar to like 40 kilos by the end of the session. And then he snatched like 100 kilos like 2 months later. But he was, I would have assumed, way too big to do anything, and could rack a barbell with the hook grip in the front rack, an empty bar.
Perfectly.
Makes no sense. Made no sense whatsoever. So there's no template to those kind of things. I think people, the template is good weightlifting coaching. That's the hard part. What people do before isn't really the problem, or there isn't really it's not the defining factor in what you do.
He was one of the biggest, most jacked, most ripped people I'd ever seen in person.
I had seen Kai Green was at a university before, so there was a bodybuilding competition at a university, and somehow they managed to get Kai Green to come and do guest posing, and Kai Green was training in the gym, and I remember walking past him. He was like enormous person in a hoodie with his hood up, and I was like, Jesus, that's one of the biggest people I've ever seen in my life. And it turned out to be Kai Green.
Yeah. There was a guy, Leo the Lion, was a bouncer in Magaluf when we went there when we were 18. Mm-hmm. And he lifted one of our buddies who was easily 120 kilos. He just strict pressed him over his head. And he was still not as big as that guy.
James C. said, Smith Jitsu said, hey, morning, gents. What do you boys think about heel elevated squats using a wedge as opposed to weightlifting shoes if it allows the athlete to get full range of motion with good back position?
I really don't like the wedges. 2 reasons. The first reason is usually the heel raise is so severe.
Yeah.
Like we were messing around in the gym last week, doing some videos for a different project, and
3 inches?
Easily 3 inches. Like the angle that your foot is at is just so far off what it will be in a weightlifting shoe. And then the second thing is, because of the fact that most of the time you're using 2 wedges or using 2 boards, and when you put your feet out to the side, your foot kind of sits at that slightly weird angle. So the line of the wedge goes straight down, but then your foot is slightly toed out. So I really just prefer people to get weightlifting shoes, or if they're starting off and they're not sure, just get them to borrow a pair of weightlifting shoes, and it tends to work better. They also tend to be so much more stable in themselves. And like, obviously, the second you start giving someone a heel raise, they'll get that better torso angle. But you don't often have that torso angle with the stability. So you might be able to sit down into that position, but they'll probably be moving forward and backwards a lot. Just having the shoes affixed to your feet makes a massive difference, I think.
One of the reasons I don't like the heel wedges is that some of your big toe will have to be on the floor, all of your toes. So essentially you're artificially rising up your toes or putting kind of extension further into your toes. So you're kind of putting your foot in a position like this unnaturally with the heel elevation, whereas in a weightlifting shoe, you're going to be in more uneven angles. So your toes will be, relatively level in relation to the bottom of your foot. And that's going to put some weird kind of pressures. I'm not talking about injury issues now or anything like that, but you are going to get some weird pressure and balance when you're in a place where your feet or the end of your toes are super elevated or super extended up at the top. And if your whole foot is flat on the wedges, then you're going to have a really weird balance issue, and your friction is going to be holding you there, and you're going to have to be applying pressure in different ways to stay on the heels, on the blocks. And again, they're generally softer material unless they're made of wood or something like that. So most of them are kind of foam or some kind of very light, low density plastic. I just don't think they're that useful for actual squatting and stuff, and setting them up, walking back, having to look if you're standing on them.
Yeah.
How consistently are you going to hit the same place? Like, you're going to do a max squat with that and try and hit the same place all the time? No, I don't.
Yeah.
Just buy basic shoes.
Where I think they see their usefulness is somebody doing a fundamental session or somebody doing their first kind of PT session in the gym, and they're doing something like med ball squats or goblet squats. And you need that person to get something done today. So you're not going to spend 40 minutes mobilizing them. You'll definitely find their deficits in terms of their mobility, and you'll start working towards fixing them. But on that day, then getting them to do some kind of goblet squats with a 16 kilo kettlebell or something can be very, very useful. But overall, in terms of like the next few weeks, you're moving towards better ankle mobility, or better ankle mobility and shoes.
That's that. I would like to have some heel wedges in my gym, in my shed. Like, you get a really good ankle stretch in them. So if you stand facing the incorrect direction with your toes facing up the block, you get a great ankle stretch. So when you're stretching your ankles, you want to be in full flexion at the bottom of your squat, and then fully extended leg at the top with a straight leg. And they're a great way of doing that. And you can actually squat down a little bit with those toes elevated to get a different kind of stretch. And again, like the assistance work, they are very useful for that. So
I do something very similar to it every single time I warm up. So even with weightlifting shoes on, I'll put my heels up on the edge of a platform or something and really just drive my knees forward, that super close stance, to get my quads kind of warmed up. They are useful. They're just not useful for kind of long-term programming of the squat.
I see a lot of people like pushing on Instagram and stuff and YouTube and stuff, saying that heel wedges are like the best way of opening up that chest angle and stuff, and just completely ignoring the fact that weightlifting shoes are much, much better option and much more convenient. And to be honest, I don't know how much those heel wedges are, but I can't imagine they're much more expensive than or much cheaper than a relatively inexpensive pair of Adidas weightlifting shoes.
Yeah, the barrier for entry for weightlifting shoes has gotten so much lower now.
And who's going to carry around wedges in your gym bag if it's not your gym, if they're not in there?
Not that strong says, thoughts on Big Friday, considering implementing it to get more reps with...
Sorry, €130 for the Rogue squat wedges. €130.
That is a disgrace.
Plus €30 delivery, so €160.
You could get a damn nice pair of weightlifting shoes for that.
Yeah.
Okay, not that strong says, thoughts on Big Friday, considering implementing it to get more reps with heavier weights, would 90% plus be the goal for these days, and how many singles, etc.? So Big Friday for me, for weightlifters, I really like it. Or Fridays on Fire, as they call it in Korea, which is kind of sick. I really like the idea of a bigger session every week. Obviously, every good program will have heavier sessions coming in every so often, but there's certain caveats with Big Fridays or kind of max out days or one big session every weekend. The first thing is that session, the aim of that session is to get good quality reps in at meaningful weights. It's the same as every other session. It doesn't mean that you go cracking into the smelling salts and slamming as much pre-workout as you can and getting this kind of false ceiling for where your weights are at the moment. It's very much still a training session, and you should treat it as such. I think people who go massively overboard, kind of really ramping stimulants, really ramping levels of arousal beforehand, you're missing the point slightly on Big Friday. The other thing you have to think about is that the times in your program where Big Fridays occur are very, very important. If you're in a prep phase, it shouldn't be in there. If you're in an off-season phase, it shouldn't be in there. If you're in a very specific phase where you're trying to accrue a lot of volume or make noticeable changes to your strength numbers, it shouldn't be in there. Big Friday really lives within that last kind of 12 to 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 8 weeks, or all the way into 0 weeks out from competition. That's where it lives. It lives in your highly specific phase of training for weightlifting. once you've done all the high volume work, once you've done all the prep work, once you've done a comprehensive off season, and then big Fridays come in. So I really like them. I think it's a good idea. It's great if you can do them with other people and you get that kind of small bump. But it's very, very important you're not doing big Fridays all the time, because you just keep maxing out, hitting the same numbers over and over again. You need to do meaningful work in your actual training sessions, and then treat this like a training session as well, not like a mini competition.
Dr. Demographic said, have rugby training at 7 and finish work at 6. Any tips to fuel myself for the session? So generally, you want to be ahead of training. You don't want to be leaving work and starting eating. Usually for like kind of strength training and stuff, you can, some people can eat half an hour beforehand. Some people right directly beforehand and get warmed up. Usually with like structured training systems in like a team sport, you're basically going to get straight into it once you're out on the pitch for kind of 7 o'clock. So realistically, you want to be finishing whatever your pre-workout food is prior to training at least an hour and a half, if not more, especially for rugby training, where it's going to be fairly intense for the 1 hour and a half to 2 hours of your training. I'd be looking at like hydration for most of the day. So I think sometimes people only think about hydration kind of during or beforehand, but I would be looking at kind of the hydration aspect earlier in the day. So by the time you get there, you're not just pissing everywhere because you drank a load of water before training. If you find that it's not possible for you to eat within 2 hours before training, if you finish at 6 and if you can't eat something at 5 for whatever reason, whatever you're doing, wherever it is, I would probably looking at smaller meals. So a little bit of protein and a little bit of carbohydrates before training, and then your intra workout would probably contain mostly carbohydrates depending on your caloric allowance. So maybe something between 50 to 75 grams of carbohydrates, and I would dilute that at, I think at the moment the best recommendation is from Andy Galpin in relation to hydration, and it is for every 15 minutes of exertion you have essentially, it works out about 200 mils per 15 minutes. So for like most people, depending on your body weight, that's like an hour and a half or something if you're like north of 100 kilos or so. So I'd be diluting your carbohydrates with that. Dextrose, glucose, doesn't really matter what it is as long as it doesn't bloat you. And then you're kind of sipping that during training. Don't use that as license for extra calories. Don't be like, okay, so this is my normally calories, but I can have those extra 75 during training, and it's not going to be the same, because that's a good road to have an extra. Carbs are like 3 grams or 4 grams or 3 calories per gram of carbohydrates. So that's an extra couple hundred calories a day where you'll quickly get extra fatty if you are doing that.
Very quick.
So yeah, the intra workout, I'd probably add in some essential amino acids as well. They're relatively cheap, something like 10 grams of them. And then on top of that, then Alex Heal is a great person for this as well, but some creatine in there also. So between 5 and 10 grams of creatine, depending on what your body weight is and how much and how intense your training is. But I wouldn't leave it till lastminute.com. I'd try to be eating sooner or really small amounts across that kind of 3-hour period from like 6 to kind of whenever you're finished training, or in a really, really, really digestible format.
Yeah, I think the massive challenge you're going to come against is, so most rugby sessions, you won't have any intra workout. Like you'll be drinking water from where everyone else is drinking water. In that case, you really need to think about your midday meals and think about making them like much more substantial, like taking on the kind of main meal of the day at 2 or 3 o'clock. Kind of like eating your dinner in the middle of the day rather than it being an after training thing. In that case, I'd probably really focus on good amount of carbs, a lot of protein and a small amount of fat. And then just before you go training, so that like finishing work at 6 p.m., assuming you're driving some distance or walking some distance to get there, you need something that you can take in like 5 minutes. Make sure it's not going to massively spike your insulin. Make sure it's not going to sit in your stomach. So that's the other main thing. When Garf is talking about not just drinking immediately beforehand, you don't want all of that liquid or all that food sitting in your stomach. So for a lot of people, some cereal will be absolutely perfect to have just in the hour before. You've got it done by like 6:05 and you're finished. And definitely you don't want to lean into the fats too much. You don't want any of that sitting in your stomach. It is really this thing of like, you would need to think about your meals over the course of the day being super level with your energies. definitely staying away from any of the kind of pre-workout products when you're
Oh yeah.
like really you don't want to be stimming up before rugby training, midweek evening sessions.
Fuck no.
No, so it is like it's a thing of managing volume that's in your stomach right now when you're going into training, then making sure the second training finishes, you get like if you're not doing the intra workout carbs, because I'd be doubtful in most teams in Ireland where you're going to have the opportunity to do that. You're just going to grab your shake, have a good block of carbs, some protein, probably 2-to-1 carb to protein in that, slam that straight away after before you even get into the shower. And then,
But did you not have a liter and a half during training?
no,
Why would you not be able to do that?
you're drinking water bottles with everyone else.
Oh yeah, but you could just bring it with you. Like,
Yeah,
there's no reason not to do that.
yeah. I'd be interested to see,
Would they stop you doing
Yeah.
that? Why would they stop you doing that?
because why the fuck aren't you drinking with everyone else?
That's some dumb shit.
Yeah,
That's
that's I'm telling you, that's what happens at. I know some of that changed during COVID because it's sharing water bottles, but most teams,
Yeah.
even drinking water during the session is
Fuck.
it's like 45 seconds done, back to training.
Yeah, that's some dumb shit. One thing, I think often goes super under the radar and people completely forget about in these scenarios is the more well conditioned you are, the better metabolic health you're in, the more appropriately lean you are, the so much easier all this will be. Like if you're you're Blaine McConnell.
Yeah.
Blaine, if you're still watching that, go look at Blaine's Instagram. You're 100 kilos, you're 10 to 12% body fat, metabolically, you've eaten you're really healthy, you've eaten clean all the time. Your ability to break down all of those foods, assimilate them in a shorter period of time is so much more effective. Like having a fairly high aerobic threshold or anaerobic threshold, pushing those to the limits makes you just so much more assimilating those, digesting those within reason. Like, you eat them 2 huge pizzas, everyone's fucked, okay? But if you're eating the appropriate meals before training and you're in really good condition and you didn't go into the off season or you didn't take that midwinter break for 2 weeks and do fuck all or something or eat a shitload of food, you kept training and you do your outside conditioning to the appropriate level, your ability to eat at 6 o'clock and be training by 7 is going to be so much better than if you are a fucking mess,
Yeah,
and
100%.
that's a lot of people's problems, and that's a lot of like weightlifters' problems. It's a lot of
strength athletes in general.
Yeah, they're like, oh, I really bloated before training and I can't train for 2 hours. It's because you're a fucking mess. Like,
yeah.
I can't eat before 2 hours of training, and you're like, first of all, you're either eating too much or you're a mess. Like
I used to be eating all the way up until getting in the car and being in the car going to training, like 15-20 minutes before.
Yeah.
And I used to have same thing pretty much every day. A 2 and a bit tablespoon scoop of instant coffee, maybe 2 tablespoons of sugar on top of that, and then a pint of milk, blended up. Then I'd have around a half packet of biscuits with probably a third of a tub of protein.
What kind of biscuits were you eating?
And that was it, digestive biscuits.
Digestives
used to be perfect because you'd be able to crack it in half.
Yeah.
And it would get into the protein or the peanut butter tub.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd just sit there. And I'd be finishing biscuits as I'm walking in to get changed.
You need to clarify, Fitz is desperately trying to put on mass.
Could not do it, Jack.
Desperately trying to put on weight.
Could not be bigger.
But this is a great example of what I'm talking about, is that Fitz was like 17, training a million times a week, eating a bajillion calories. And these were, I would call, most trainers or most nutritionists, not trainer, would say they're inappropriate calories, or less than ideal calories before training. And they still didn't affect you because you were in such a well-trained state, and I think that's really, that is more important or as important as the nutritional component if you're a mess,
Yeah.
And Dr. Grammers, I'm not saying you're a mess.
No, not at all.
I'm aggressively talking generalities here for people, when it comes to that kind of stuff.
He did just add later on, he said, or just get through the session. Definitely don't just try and get through the session. You want
Would they really stop you drinking?
100%.
That's so
There's
dumb.
some coaches wouldn't let you drink water during a session.
That is outrageous.
Just don't want to be a soft cock.
Yeah.
Being a tough gun's more important than being hydrated.
That's so dumb. That reminds me of that county team where they were recording the GPS data, the GA county team, and they were recording the mileage or kilometers they were doing, but then completely disregarding that data that they were recording and saying people were being soft because they were getting injured.
I had forgotten about that story. Okay, up next then we have Sam Maloney, and he says, best high force trunk exercises.
Sorry, Dr. Graphic says low-key MMS, to be fair.
He says, which are easy to set up, minimal equipment, more thinking top end force transfer as opposed to conditioning or capacity or work capacity. So in terms of the trunk training, the trunk, the squat and the deadlift, definitely. More specifically, the conventional deadlift and the high bar back squat will probably be your best two. If we look at something like the front squat, it will still tax your trunk. It will tax it slightly more anteriorly, but the relative loads just aren't the same in the front squat as they are in the back squat. So definitely the back squat, definitely the deadlift. If you're talking about more
Specific.
just the trunk,
Side bends,
yeah,
tail off press, back extension holds, back extensions,
plank, weighted plank, single leg plank, all of those.
Yeah.
All of those really standard things, but there's a lot of damn strong people out there who are just squatting and deadlifting.
Yeah.
Banana bread, emoji banana, emoji bread, says, question regarding barefoot squatting. Started squatting thanks to you lads. Oh, that's class. Went from 150 pounds to 300 plus pounds. Nice. In a few months. No problems. Because martial arts, I had good ankle mobility. Is this okay? Or must I buy weird stripper shoes? Nah, if you've good mobility,
you need to buy €160 stripper board wedges for your feet. No, you don't.
You're good to go. That's some good progress in a few months.
Yeah.
Willie says pull it slower. That is all.
He's consistent.
Kaiser 306 says, how would you program Nordic curls for hypertrophy? Don't have any machines to do leg curls. This is difficult. Nordic curls for most people sit at the slightly higher intensity or slightly higher on the intensity scale. So for most people, doing a full rep of a Nordic curl where they touch their hips and their nose to the ground at the same time and come back up, one full rep is a big undertaking, and most people will train a long time to try and do one rep. Now, that being said, the partial reps, just the descents, just the isometrics, all of those will help with hypertrophy. Most noticeably, the controlled descent, so the eccentric portion of the Nordic, where you're just reaching out down towards the floor, your hips are trying to get to the floor, that will be good, right? But in many cases, even that will be slightly too high in the intensity scale. And this is the difficult thing. You're going to be the regulator of intensity. It's how long you hold on to that position, how tightly you squeeze your hamstrings, how much you really squeeze into that position before you actually leave go and fall to the floor. That's the difficult thing. The tracking of that intensity from week to week is very difficult. If you tried very hard, I'm sure that after 1 or 2 sets of 5 to 8 reps, you'd be toast on Nordics. I also think if you really weren't trying very hard, you could probably do 10 sets of 10 on Nordics and feel pretty good about yourself and not have that much cramping or pain in the hamstring. So in cases like that, it's very difficult to use the hamstring Nordic curl as a direct hypertrophy piece. You'd be much better off spending 10 or 15 euro on something like a power band and doing banded hamstring curls just for hypertrophy. So we're massive fans of the Nordic hamstring curl here. Basically all of our athletes get them fairly regularly, but it's not the exercise for hypertrophy. It's not the thing. It's like a bicep curl versus strict weighted chin-ups.
Yeah, it is really. Yeah, it's
just a bit too much pizzazz.
Logan McMahon said, setting up my classroom while listening to lads, sore cell from training this week, but I'm loving it. Thanks for listening, Logan. Jam said, roughly how often should you snatch, clean, jerk as a beginner? 3 to 5 times per week for each movement.
Say twice a day.
So there's actually a great opportunity to learn much more in detail about this particular stuff. So on this Saturday, we are doing our snatch masterclass, Saturday 26th. 26th. It is going to be from 2 to 6 p.m. Or is it 1 to 5 or 2 to 6? What do you think?
What it says it on the ad.
Sorry, yeah. So in the afternoon, Irish time, 2 to 6 for approximately 4 hours, a bit under 4 hours by the time we get done. Snatch masterclass, going through all of the snatch programming, technique, variants, mistakes, assistance work, mobility, And if you're an athlete or a coach, or you're trying to learn to snatch, this is a great opportunity. So it's €100 for 4 hours, about 25 or more years of weightlifting between myself and Fitz. Lots of different great athletes we've interacted with and coaches, and literally thousands of athletes assisted with and programmed for and coached, and in-person coaching, practical evidence, literature, scientific literature, theoretical evidence, anecdotal evidence, all of that is combined. So how often do you snatch, clean, jerk as a beginner? So basically, when it comes to the snatch, the clean and jerk, it's generally, for most people, say just for the snatch, the clean and jerk is, snatch is going to be always a little bit higher frequency in the clean and jerk basically all throughout your career, and most of the time it's going to look something like 2 clean and jerk, but it's either clean and jerk and clean and jerk variant, or clean and jerk complex, or clean and jerks singles and doubles on separate days. So it's usually 2 sessions of clean and jerks or variants. And then for the snatch, it's usually going to be about 3 times the kind of week for those snatch. It's going to be snatch variation, snatch again, snatch hang, snatch block, whatever it is from you're doing in your training. Generally, the snatch will be an additional percentages on to the clean and jerk, because the clean and jerk is heavier. It's more fatiguing, and you need to be in better condition to hit heavier clean and jerks. So for most people, snatching or some variation is going to be 3 times a week, maybe twice a week, to maybe depending on how often you're training. And the clean and jerk then is always going to be a little bit less than the snatch in terms of frequency.
JSM94 says, sup lads from Sweden. Sup, JSM. Not That Strong says, any videos coming out with other Irish weightlifters like Sean Brown? We don't have any directly planned now, but there's always always scope for making videos.
Yeah, sure.
Varden says, how do I remove the negative thoughts from my mind when training? When training's not going well, is it worth doing weightlifting? Why am I doing it? Will I get any better? And I'm also waiting for your India trip. So firstly, we'll go anywhere in the world if you want to organize a seminar. You just send us an email, sikastrength@gmail.com.
Isn't Zach?
We could send you. He wanted to go to India. But that's always an option. So direct question then about removing negative thoughts from your head. So there's a couple of things you need to think about in this sphere, right? So the first thing is, negative thoughts happen. Negative thoughts aren't great for you, but it's never something you're going to remove 100% from your mind when you're doing a sport or when you're doing a particular task, particularly when that sport or task is very, very challenging. So there's a couple of different ways or a couple of different things you can go about to start doing it. The first thing is, you really need to have a set reason for training in your head. So if there's no motivation for you to go and do that, if you don't have a high level of kind of intrinsic or extrinsic motivation to be doing this thing, then when those intrusive thoughts come in, it's very, very difficult for you to fight against them. And you'll end up kind of ruminating on those thoughts more and more as the task becomes more difficult or level of intensity increases. If there's no direct reason for you to be doing it, or you've no kind of main motivational basis for doing it, then it'll be futile to be fighting against this. Now, the other thing you can look at this as slightly different way to look at it is the perception of those thoughts. So changing your perception, the frame in which you view these negative thoughts, can be very, very valuable. And this is as much a skill you refine and a skill you work on as anything else is. So take, for example, you're out running and it's raining outside and you're like, oh my God, I'm getting rained on. Why the hell am I doing this? This is terrible. I might get a cold. This feels horrendous. Everybody else is inside. You can also view that in a slightly different perception of, everybody else is inside and I'm the only one out able to run. Or if you're competing in track and field or cross country or something, you're saying, oh, that rain is keeping everybody inside and I'm the only one who's able to go out and train in this. And suddenly that kind of negative situation that you're perceiving, or the negative thoughts you're ruminating on, are now slightly more positive. But framing and working on your perception is a very direct skill in itself, and you probably have to do some exercises to work on it. So the main thing I would say, Varden, is have your immediate motivations very, very front and centered in your brain. If that means writing them on your training journal or writing them on your shoes, that will do it. If it means having a quick kind of 3-minute recap at the start of every day, or 3-minute recap or few moments to yourself before you start training, say, this is why I'm training towards this. This is what I want to do. This is why I'm doing this particular session. Those negative thoughts are an awful lot less loud in your head afterwards.
The next one's probably for you as well there.
Banana Bread says, CTE in sport, greatest risk in boxing with direct impact, but still feel vibrations through your body impact. Examples, rugby and judo. Are indirect concussions possible even if neck is strong? Is CTE risk still high? Yes, very high. Yeah. Massive incidence of concussion or concussive episodes from non-head impact injuries. Very, very, very high. Even like neck strength is important. The leanness of the muscle tissue in the neck is important. But yeah, getting hits to the body in American football, in rugby, in hockey, anything that's causing sudden acceleration and deceleration of your head is going to be a risk for concussive episodes and then an increased risk of CTE following on.
Talked to a lot of our jiu-jitsu friends who also do MMA, and I was trying to explain a few weeks ago that no amount of blows to the head is a good one. No blow to the head is okay. All blows to the head are bad.
There's no reasonable amount of concussions per year.
Yeah, they're like a little knock to your head is like, there's a threshold obviously where something gets bad or worse, but there's no blow to the head where there's like positive adaptions. You know, they're not shaking out the calcium deposits or the calcification of your neurons or anything like that. There's all blows to the head, especially when it comes to elite force. Like if you walk out the door and bump your head off the door, it's whatever, it's fine. It's not a big deal. It's not going to make any difference, but it's still not a good thing. But when it comes to people, grown men punching you in the head, all of those punches are bad. All of them are bad, and they all add up. And yeah. Rick Wakeman said, do you have any suggestions for an endurance runner who's adding in strength training for the first time? Good job. My XCTF college coach,
cross country and track and field.
Go on, Fitz. Was weary of anything over body weight, running second 50K in December. So the addition of strength training is something that is incredibly useful for endurance sports, and especially someone running the nearly marathon distance or so. Best place to start is just treat yourself pretty much like any other strength training athlete. For runners, basically because runners don't really take off seasons, they take kind of less running volume or they're peaking for races. In fairness to runners, of all the kind of non-elite sports, runners are the best at going through phasic structure of training because it's kind of the cultural thing. I'd rather than I think anyone's really thought about it, or the average person. Everyone kind of increases their mileage gradually, mostly because it's self-limiting, which I think is probably part of it too. And so as they go through those periods and you get closer to the competition, they increase their mileage and try and do a little bit more. So in general, try and match your strength training kind of inversely with that within reason. As your beginner, though, you don't necessarily have to match inversely completely. You can keep tipping away very slowly. Now, Rick, I could point you to the beginner strength training program on the website, just if you're looking to get something and have it there ready for you to go. It's a little beginner strength training. It's not weightlifting or powerlifting. It's just basic strength training. But what I would probably do is twice a week is a nice place to start. So you're adding in some strength training for the first time. Assuming you're an older athlete, if you're talking about your cross country, track and field, assuming in college, so you're saying in college, you're at least in your late 20s now or mid 20s or something like that. So I would start off with twice a week, and I'd be looking at one larger movement that you like doing, and then two smaller movements that either complement that or are far enough away from the other strength training movements that they won't fatigue you. So let's say, for example, you've decided that you want to do front squats. I'd probably recommend back squats, but you pick front squats. Pick front squats, and then maybe pick something like upper back exercises, and then maybe rear delts and horizontal rows or something like that, and just do those. And then the next day, pick something else, pick another big lift that you like, start off that session with that. And it might be weighted pull-ups or something like that, or it might be benching, or it might be deadlifting, or whatever it is that you kind of decide that you're going to pick up on, and then pick other movements that kind of complement that session. Maybe you do benching, do some single arm dumbbell work, and do some core work again. And don't stress about it too much. Just start doing the strength training and doing those lifts for a period of time until you familiarize yourself with strength training. Keep it to twice a week. Keep the sets and reps nice and moderate. Don't kill yourself for the period of time until you kind of adapt it, because generally runners have a lot of volume, and the last thing you want to do is go face first into a huge amount of strength training. You want to slowly let it acclimatize, like you would if you're introducing conditioning into a weightlifter's routine or a powerlifter. You go super slowly over the course of months and months when it's appropriate, and build up the tolerance. You don't go straight into hill sprints and 5Ks. You go
Maybe you might.
you go zone 2, stationary bike, rowing, something like that for a nice period of time. You go for extended walks if someone's very out of shape, and then you slowly increase the intensity and maybe the severity of the conditioning. And it's the same way with strength training. You just go in the opposite direction. You do nice and smooth and very tempered approach, lower frequency. And to be honest with you, a lot of runners could stick with twice a week for a long time, especially ultra marathon or marathon plus distances. You could really be sticking with twice a week, and if there are smart sessions, you'll get a lot of benefit out of those.
Rick Wakeman sounds like an American athlete from the 80s who's just after winning the 1600 meter final. Rick Wakeman. Okay. Gems94 says, want to ask you guys if you've read Niels van der Poel's training manifesto, basically his training philosophy and his training leading up to 2 worlds and 2 Olympic golds. He pretty much did no strength training because he viewed the events as aerobic in nature and wanted to do more zone 2 and threshold instead. No, I haven't. Two things. First thing is, people have very, very different reactions or different reactions to training stimulus. And when you're at that level, it might just be a genetic predisposition that he needed more aerobic work. He might have been incredibly fast and incredibly powerful. He then needed more aerobic work, or needed his focus of his training to be aerobic. While somebody else might have a phenomenal VO2 max genetically, or from their formative years, and they'll need more power work, they'll need more speed work. And that's where the real danger with training manifestos comes in, where you say, this is how you train, and this is how you do something like this. Like, this is how you achieve greatness in a sport, when a sport like speed skating is incredibly power dependent, and saying now suddenly that no strength training and no power training should be done, you just don't know. You can easily say that for him, that was probably the best way, but you don't actually know, because if he had a twin who had the exact same upbringing, you don't know if that twin would have been better off, one doing a bit of strength training and normal training, and one doing no training and just their normal training. It's interesting, but I'd always take those athletes' personal accounts with a pinch of salt.
Yeah, so to be honest, it's likely if he was, what did he win? 2 Olympic golds, probably on gear. And that a lot of that, just to be honest, negates a lot of the stuff. So I always liken it to, if you imagine you have a load of flasks full of water, and each one of those flasks represents your ability, and one flask is your strength, and one flask is your power, and one flask is your aerobic conditioning. If you're taking maybe anabolic steroids, but there's other specific drugs that will raise each flask individually, but usually if you're taking gear, those flasks themselves will just fill up to a certain level, and depending on your genetics, predisposition, training, all that stuff, those flasks will fill to a certain extent. That means you can hit what you need to hit in training or do in your sport without needing to actually directly train those attributes. So if you have those 2 skaters and one of them is taking a fuck ton of Winstrol, the chances are his power development is just going to go up a lot, even if he's not doing anything like that. Those 2 athletes never trained. They're just doing speed skating. One of them takes a load of Winstrol or stanazolol, and they go to the gym and back squat for the first time, and they max out, balls out. The athlete who's taking a load of stanazolol is just going to have a higher back squat than the person who didn't. And a lot of the times, we talked about this before. I made a power development video a couple of months ago. That's kind of the formula for power production. and I answered or addressed some potential whataboutisms at the end. And one of the whataboutisms is fucking LeBron James never stepped foot in the gym. He's squatting 60 kilos to parallel, and stuff like that. And you're like, look, their genetic predisposition means that they're a freak in nature, and what they do doesn't really apply to you. But I'd make the argument that them doing correct training would still make them better, like what Dara was implying there. But also, a lot of these elite athletes, most of them are on performance enhancing drugs, and we have to be super selective and inferring outcomes from the stuff they do. And look, there's no men who've done more traveling and talked to more elite athletes and coaches than us. So we're not saying that these boys know best because we just came up out of nowhere. It's just that you have to be super conscientious of looking at someone and going, are they doing that because that's the most sensible thing to do, or are they getting at that because it's in spite of the most sensible thing to do?
If you want to see a classic case to this, just look at the sport of jiu-jitsu, and you'll see people who never do any weight training. They mightn't even look like they do any weight training, yet they're strong enough to break grips and break through positions and break down the postures of everyone else. And they'll be like, man, I never do any strength. No, it's about jiu-jitsu, man.
Yeah.
And they'll train for 8 hours a day, be absolute animals. And
the thing is as well is that if you're an elite level athlete and you can dedicate all of your recovery to training, and with or without PEDs, if you do enough sport specific activity in training with the correct recovery and you build up the volume incrementally so you can keep matching your intensity, eventually you will, because of sport specific demands, train the specific physical attributes you need. And if you're talented enough and you do enough volume, you could in theory accommodate and account for all the physical attributes you need in your training, so that eventually you meet the threshold for each one of these individual flasks, if you think about them that way. So that when you're doing your sport, because you've done so much of your sport with or without PEDs, that you've got the requisites to be winning those goals.
Okay, up next then we have Mad Chris Lifts. He says, do you have any video on increasing ankle mobility? I think it's one of the reasons my squat has to be so wide. We don't have a video on it, which is strange because we have a video on most things, but definitely go and look at Kelly Starrett in terms of the ready state, or someone like Aaron Harshig, Squat University. To be honest, I really like Kelly's stuff on the ankles. I used it a lot when my ankle mobility was bad, and I've also used it a lot when coaching groups of athletes who had terrible ankles. So that stuff would be my recommendation.
After so we have a big project finishing up in the next few weeks, and once that's done, we're going to do a lot more in-gym practical videos.
Yeah,
we'll try to get one out a week, so stay tuned for those and the big projects.
James C says, have you found after doing BJJ that the posture you tend to use playing guard affects your thoracic spine?
I don't play guard, so I wouldn't know. Fitz loves playing guard because he's a kid.
Yes, everything, like, it's just rounding forward to your shoulders. It's not even from playing guard for me. It's just that kind of clenched in position. Yeah, it does. It definitely just is terrible for your posture.
Well, it ruined my elbow mobility.
Yeah.
Although, yeah, this side, it's just so annoying that one side is like that.
Yeah.
I wonder why I just didn't notice it.
Oh, look at that lockout.
So weird it didn't affect you at all.
It's what happens when you have no muscle mass.
I wonder, yeah, it's all that gi grabbing.
Patrick Brady says, how many pairs of RAM 2s does Garth have?
I think I have...
not half enough?
I think I have 3 pairs of RAM 2s. 3 pairs, yeah. Yeah.
Do you have 2 black pairs?
No, someone offered me a pair of black pairs recently, but I did not accept. I should have followed up on it because you can never have too many RAM 2s.
No. Milano says, what are your thoughts on dumbbell or barbell pullovers? The exercise seems to be shrouded in nonsense, example, rib cage expansion, but it seems to engage more muscles than any other upper body exercise. They're grand. They're really grand. They can be quite nice for some overhead mobility, like lying on a bench and just going through that range of motion. But yeah, I don't know anybody who does them. is what I'll say. I know Garth did them for a while for upper body mobility, but
I still actually do them a little bit with like a 2.5 kilo plate, the pullovers as a kind of a warm up, but not with a dumbbell or barbell. Anytime I've done them with a weighted kind of broomstick and palms facing me, so kind of a supinated grip coming back like this. So it's good for internal rotation. Or at the moment, I'll do them with a very light dumbbell or plate in my hand, and I'll just reach back. I'll be lying on my back on a bench, shoulders over the edge, and then reaching back with those. But other than that, that's specifically for mobility and end range of motion for your shoulder. But they seem to kind of fall out of favor a little bit with kind of the bodybuilders.
Square says best weightlifting shoe for below $100 to $150. This is a bit of advice. You go on Facebook, go on your local area CrossFitters or like Irish CrossFitters or UK CrossFitters, and there's weightlifting shoes for sale every 30 minutes. That is my number one piece of advice. Rather than looking for a brand new shoe for like a budget shoe, I just go on there and wait till like a set of Reebok Legacy 3s or Nike 2s or something pops up. Or else wait for something like a Black Friday sale. All of these things can be really, really useful. But yeah, CrossFitters tend to buy a lot of weightlifting shoes, and maybe they move them on a bit quicker than everyone else. So that would be my advice, would be join as many of those groups as possible, and you get some screaming deals.
Yeah, does that still happen, do you think?
I still see them popping up.
The loads of them don't like wearing wave shoes anymore now, because loads of the elite CrossFitters
Just not cool.
Because they snatch and they're fucking nanos or nobles or whatever.
Frank says, if interested in progressing both powerlifting and weightlifting, how should one go about this, seen as training all five all the time is in most cases unachievable? You've said it all. You need to do a weightlifting block, then a powerlifting block, then a weightlifting block, then a powerlifting block. In my experience, I've trained a fair few like pretty good athletes in super total. Usually you need to spend probably twice as amount of time in weightlifting blocks than you do in powerlifting. You probably run a maximum of 2 powerlifting blocks a year. And yeah, you just do it like that. If the rare opportunity arises to then compete in a super total competition, you basically run a weightlifting block with some bench pressing in it, and kind of fairly heavy squat focus. But that's it. I do like 8 to 12 weeks of powerlifting, then 16 weeks of weightlifting, 20 weeks of weightlifting, 8 weeks of powerlifting, 20 weeks of weightlifting. But it's really, really difficult. You'd actually be better off doing 8 months of weightlifting, 4 months of powerlifting, 8 months of weightlifting, 4 months of powerlifting. So powerlifting ends up being a very nice kind of prep phase for your weightlifting. But yeah, it's very, very difficult. And that's my main recommendation. Don't try and do it all at the same time.
No injury questions. So we've got the shoulder impingement. Memory Carbon 1000 said, when squatting, should you actually push your pelvis under you or push it towards your anterior pelvic tilt towards the bottom so you don't get too rounded? Fight the weight to keep a flat back. So this kind of depends on your builds a little bit. Depends on what kind of squat you're doing. So if you're doing high bar or if you're doing low bar. Depends on stance width, ankle mobility. So like if you're someone with hypermobile ankles, very quad dominant lifter, super upright high bar back squat, when you're squatting to the bottom of your squat, you're going to want to kind of sit your hips into the bottom of that squat to drive forward with the quads. However, you don't want to sit so far forward that you end up with a large amount of lower back rounding or butt wink. Conversely, then some lifters might need a little bit more even distribution between the hips and the quads. So they might think about starting the squat with the hips and the knees breaking at the same time. So their hips go slightly back, knees go forward as they're sitting straight down. This allows them to keep a nice consistent angle as much as possible throughout the lift. And then it depends. So they're not going to sit their pelvic or their hips in at the bottom of the squat. So it kind of depends on the lifter, depends on their position, depends on a couple of different things. But sometimes you do want to sit your hips in the bottom. Sometimes then it might be much better. For example, Fitz isn't going to want to actually sit E-sips in the bottom of the squat or be able to, but he might need to think about it, for example. So it kind of depends on a couple of different things in regards to that particular issue.
Okay, up next then we've Dave Berman. Yeah. Why do athletes have to spend so much time on technique? Why isn't it just intuitive to find the most efficient manner to move? So this actually is the biggest misconception, I think, in sport or in skilled learning, right? However feels best for you to move is almost never the best way for you to move. And this becomes more and more apparent at higher intensities, at higher levels of force output, and at higher levels of difficulty with the skill. So it is almost never going to be the right way. And this is something as a coach you deal with on a regular basis, where someone says, I feel so much better when I just turn my feet out, or when I go into that narrower stance, or when my knees push like this, or when my back is like this. The human body has no concept of what safe ranges of motion are, what the most biomechanically efficient ranges of motion are. The true test of this is something called regression to secondary positions. When, take for example, you're lifting a heavy stone from the floor. That stone is too heavy for you to have a straight back angle with. And so you regress to a secondary position of systematic rounding of the spine, and you wrap around the stone and hold on to it. You see this in over and over and over again in kind of natural human movement, where we get these regressions to secondary positions. And this is when you're coaching, you're banging your head against this wall every hour of the day, trying to get people into better positions. Intuition is worth nothing in sport. The only time intuition is worth something in sport is for tactical awareness of certain situations. And in that case, it's not your intuition, it's your experience of previous circumstances and how that might be forming your particular opinion. So Owen is playing in a back line in a rugby match with me, and I could see a line of defenders in front of me. I might intuitively know that I'm going to cut inside and take a pop back inside from Owen as Owen continues to run his line. That is not intuition, and people will call that intuition all the time. Commentators will say that's phenomenal intuition. That's not intuition. That is an informed decision that seems to be subconscious to me, that's being relayed from hours and hours or thousands of hours of experience. And so the intuitive movement thing is just anybody who tells you that, or the kind of natural movement thing, it's just really not it. You're really on the wrong track there for correct biomechanics. Correct biomechanics look directly at biology and biology's interaction with physics, and those two things, understanding the spinal structure of your spinal column, understanding the shapes and how those shapes in our spinal column interact, then understanding physics, the basic physics of leverages, force, shear force versus compressional force, all of these things. That's what dictates correct technique. Intuition is terrible. It's why you see a lot of basketballers jumping and their knees will dip in as they jump down, and they'll have that valgus knee rotation. That's intuitive, and it's highly incorrect.
Yeah, I see this argument recently where the people talk about that. I've seen a few places, but they were saying that like your technique at maximum loads is a representation of what your technique should be looking like, and I just can't think of a more wrong statement. The fact that it just makes the assumption that because you have technical breakdown at a maximum lift means that that's how you should be lifting. Like that's so like
It's just misguided.
That is a misguided argument. This idea that your CNS finds a way. Your CNS's main priority is to stop you hurting yourself. To decelerate movements, interact with the environment around you via mechanoreceptors and chemoreceptors, temperature receptors. You detect something hot, your body just takes it away from it. Sport isn't inherently something that's natural. A maximum back squat isn't something that is something that your body knows you're going to be doing over and over again, and your body's going to be adding weight to it. Your body doesn't think in that way. There's not a direct path that your body automatically moves. Like, you have to teach it to the most optimal ways to move and repeat that over and over again. And this idea that what feels best is the right way, or what you regress at heavier weights is the right way. It's like, no, what you regress to is irrelevant. What feels is irrelevant. You address those issues and try and repeat it so that your technique gets better the next time you go heavier or the next time you do your particular sport. It's not, it's very misguided to assume that what you do at heavier weights is useful, or if you see a particular elite athlete with a nuance in their technique, and we're assuming that, yep, that's that kind of nuance is the new thing, that's the new Fosbury flop or whatever, or that nuance is green light for everyone else, carte blanche to start doing their own little quirks, But it's Lou Zhaojun, for example, turns the barbell over and opens his hook grip, and sometimes I think he used to slide his grip out a little bit further. That's not carte blanche for everyone to go snatching, or it's not an indicator that this is a better way of doing it. It's just that in spite of doing this, Lou Zhaojun still lifts pretty good weights. So it's an interesting one, but yeah.
That's, to be honest, there's a lot of of those natural movement people and stuff online. That's not the right word, but anyway, to be honest, that's one of the biggest things they get wrong, is a misunderstanding of biomechanics from a kind of fundamentals level, that a misunderstanding of how the human body works, which probably shouldn't be surprised with. Orlando Swift says, advice on training and lifestyle practices for avoiding re-tear of meniscus while still strength training and playing sports. So we can't really directly inform you on your rehab, right? But Orlando, if you've come back and you fully rehab and you're fully clear to take part in exercise again, what I would begin by looking at is, okay, what are the main breakdowns in what I'm doing, and then why might that be causing risks to my meniscus, right? So let's say, for example, your sport requires you to run a lot, and in all of that running you have a mistimed stride, or something is wrong and your heel striking a lot, your meniscus is taking a lot of wear and tear. Or maybe you're doing a combat sport in your particular style for that, so you might do jiu-jitsu and you might do a lot of half guard, and now your knee is being torqued a lot. That's just the way you're playing the game, or whatever it is, whatever your style of doing that thing, that might be identified as one of the key risks, right? Or you might have chronic internal rotation or external rotation in your hip, which causes that to be an issue. I then would refer to that as your prehabilitation work, and that becomes the kind of main focus for the beginning of your return to training. So prehab will probably take 40 to 60% of total training load, and then everything about else around that is just building up your capacities to get back to normal training. As you come back into full training, then going back to whatever sport it is, you then titrate that prehab down to a kind of fundamental level where it's going to stay at that level forever. That might be 10 to 15% of every training session, or 10 to 15% of total training load is taken up with your assisted pistol squats and 5 minutes of mobility around your hips, whatever it is, whatever it might be for your specific case. It's important to know, though, that 10% never goes away. It might go away in 15 years' time when you're not competing as avidly or as kind of intensely in the sport. But if you're a runner and you get a meniscus tear and you continue to do the prehab or the rehab, and then it becomes prehab for the future, it will titrate down to a certain point, but that will never go away. And that's the most important thing with returning to training, is that prehabilitation work should be there pretty much forever. Now, if you got another injury and a subsequent injury and a subsequent injury, and now you suddenly have 3 or 4 different streams going on with that, obviously that would take up all of your time. And so now you prioritize those pieces. And you might change that around as you go through the year, or as you encounter different issues throughout the year. But it's very important that never goes away fully.
Right, we've been going about an hour.
Perfect. We'll just pick 2 or 3 questions there, guys.
Hamson fan said, can a no-gi player train like a wrestler, or should we still train like BJ competitors minus specific grip work? I would definitely be doing some more intense aerobic circuit style work if I was exclusively no-gi or did any no-gi. It's a little bit more like wrestling. It's a lot more movement, a lot more calories burned per match, I would say, or a lot more work done in terms of the whole body movement. So I'd definitely be looking at increasing the non-sport specific conditioning work in your training. I'd be looking at kind of a lot of maybe sprinting, assault bikes, higher intensity threshold stuff. I'd be looking at maybe even some body weight circuits. They've kind of fallen out of fashion in the non-wrestling sphere. Used to be a time where, mountain climbers, burpees, body weight squats and stuff were super popular. Maybe a little bit during COVID, but like 15 years ago, there was a super popular aspect. Some sandbag runs and stuff like that. Non-implemented WODs,
Intense calisthenics.
Yeah, kind of like warrior training kind of stuff wouldn't go astray if you're really trying to push that no-gi conditioning stuff. Obviously, on top of your traditional strength training.
Tobias says, when are we going to talk about the Barbie movie?
Have you seen it?
I had to go. When you go overseas for 4 or 5 weeks in a row, when you come home, you have very little bargaining power on what you do on date night. So I did go, but I did fall asleep around 40 minutes in, unfortunately. Okay, guys, thank you so much for everyone who tuned in. We will be back very, very, very soon. As always, we really appreciate you popping your questions in. If you guys have questions about the programs, questions about anything to do with Sika Strength, sikastrength@gmail.com is the best place to get us. And thanks as always for your support. Cut it right there.